Hi, everyone, and welcome to day five and our final customer showcase session of the week. I'm Shreya, a customer success manager based in Sydney, Australia. Today, we welcome Department of Families, Fairness, Housing from the Victorian State Government, who we'll refer to as DFFH going forward. Before we move into the main event, I'd like to share that this session is being recorded and you will be sent a copy afterwards. You'll also notice a resources section in the events console, and you'll find supporting documents that relate to the content that we'll be covering. Let's start with a brief agenda. I'll introduce you to our guest speaker from DFFH and then pass you over to our host for what promises to be an insightful session. We've allowed time at the end for your questions for an even deeper insight into DFFH's EA journey. You'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so please submit your questions as we go, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So without further ado, it's time to meet our experts. A big warm welcome to our guest speaker and valued customer, Paul Monks. Paul has a long background in some of the most complicated environments in government, commercial, and digital product businesses. He currently leads enterprise architecture at DFFH, one of the broadest government departments in Australia, and has previously led transformation at Services Australia, the Australian Digital Health Agency, and other health and social services organizations. And also welcome to our host, Jason Baragri, Chief EA at RDoC. Jason combines deep architectural expertise with practical insights to help organizations move beyond static plans to achieve measurable outcomes in their digital transformation journey. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Ray.
Before I pass you over to Jason, Paul, I wonder if you could give us a brief overview of DFFH for those who aren't too familiar with the Australian public sector.
Sure, and thanks, Shreya. Thanks, Jason. So DFFH, as you say, is one of the broadest government departments in Australia. We're the social services department in the state of Victoria, which is, let's call it the equal largest state in Australia. There's a couple of national federal departments that are bigger, about four that are bigger than us, but we're essentially the biggest in Victoria, and largely that's because of the breadth of what we're involved in. So we support the work of seven different ministers in the Victorian government. There's 14 ministerial portfolios: housing, child protection, disability, aging carers, family violence, etc. But beyond our direct service delivery, which is mostly around public housing and child protection, a lot of what we do is through what we call community service organisations, or 900 not-for-profits and other type of organisations distributed across the state of Victoria. So there's a lot of complexity in the work we do, both internally and the overlap that exists, because when people have social issues, they don't just tend to have one issue. There's multiple factors going on, but also quite complicated given the breadth of partners that we're in effect delivering through. The challenge that presents for enterprise architecture is it's far from just a standard direct-to-market business where you can focus on, a single strategy, your own capabilities, etc. You really need to consider that broader ecosystem around the department. So that's the DFFH in a nutshell, and the challenge that it presents for EA.
Thanks, Paul. And before I hand you over to Jason for our fireside chat, which is ironic given we're in summer here in Australia, I'll kick off with the first question. First question being, what are some of the key pain points you were looking to address when you started your search for an EA tool?
Yeah, so we're somewhat fortunate in the EA unit within DFFH in that we don't have build and run tech responsibility. We get those services from other areas. So we're basically a pure business architecture and very much focused into the broader strategy of the department and the social outcomes that we're driving towards. So a lot of our focus is very much on business architecture and business architecture in the context of a very broad and diverse business ecosystem. The challenges that presents and what we need from a EA tool then is something that has had a lot of meta model flexibility. We need to model the sorts of things that come with that breadth and scale. So because, yeah, for instance, what we're involved in um, means that there's about 60 odd strategies. And that's not wrong. There is one departmental strategy, but there's strategies for child protection workforce, child care, volunteers, all kinds of things. So stitching, showing how all of those pieces fit together, both in terms of the department and the business ecosystem, is, the key thing we were looking for from an EA tool, the flexibility to be able to capture that, not a traditional create a capability model some IT applications and infrastructure type tool, something that could stretch to the complexity that we face. Other aspects too is then the usability of that, because the volume of information we have, we need to be able to manage that in a simple way. And we're not a big team. So also being able to have what we might call citizen architects enable self-service from a lot of non-architect, maybe IT people or power business users was some of the other aspects we're looking for.
Right. I'll kick it off a bit further. Thanks, Shreya, and g'day, Paul. So let's keep it going on this tool lens a little bit, and then we'll get more into the problem solving and how you go about it. So just following on from that, where were you when you got started? Because we know many of our customers, some of them have extensive background in how to use tools to solve problems, others don't. So I'm wondering, what was your team's starting point, and what was then the transition to using a tool like Hardoc?
Yeah, so from my personal perspective, I've used a few different tools elsewhere, and I think I've seen a few different types of organization. So kind of understood, at least personally, what would be the right sort of, what was the need to, the thing to solve in this situation. But in terms of the department and the experience there, I guess fairly typical of environments that haven't had much tool use, don't really appreciate the sometimes constraints that come along with structured meta modeling. So very much the typical Visio, PowerPoint, Excel type environment. And hence, my point around usability and low maintenance being as important as the meta model extensibility, because it's very much been a journey to understand, well, you can draw whatever you want on a PowerPoint, that's great, but it's locked in that particular page, right? Shifting that to be data and create all kinds of visualizations of that requires a far more methodical approach.
Yeah.
And you can't just draw whatever you want. And there need to be a bit of structure around that. So that's kind of where we were starting from a overall team dynamics and culture kind of perspective as well.
Okay, nice. I mean, yeah, we definitely see this in other situations as well. It's definitely a trade-off. Of course, we're in the product business, so we like to push it and how wonderful it is. But there's the other side as well, which is the discipline it takes to get the most out of it. And I think we'll get to more of that as we get into more of the details about what you've done and how you've tried to move progressively across. So if we start going into the vision, you mentioned that you're more of a trending towards business architecture end of the spectrum of EA. But I've been lucky enough to see you talk about what you do and chat with you. And I know Shrey has been very involved with what you're doing as well. And we've spoken about it. And you have had many architects working in the projects. So you are
Mm.
quite operational as a team as well. So how did you start to make that journey towards more of the strategy shapers rather than the active participants in the tools? I'm sorry, in the process.
Yeah, yeah. So I think part of that too is not trying to force everyone to understand architecture or the tool as well. Um, Capturing things in a way that's understandable and relatable. And that doesn't just mean using the language of the business. It's also about just using plain, simple language in the first instance. So that's kind of been a key piece. My boss, the CIO, has a mantra of us moving from being what he describes as order takers to demand shapers. And we can kind of think of that as well. Is the business coming to IT with clear solutions in mind? And you're not even part of that, how to evolve the business discussion, versus moving towards actually you're part of shaping the demand that's coming in. You're influencing the direction. And not all of that is EA in the tool. Obviously, that is genuinely understanding the business that you're in. But certainly being able to show little bits and pieces. So, for instance, there's this there's this wonderful complexity in the Victorian government, in a lot of governments, where we have social outcomes that we're delivering towards, but then there's also outputs that get measured, which are where we're spending money and different things like that, which is different again to objectives, our strategic objectives.
Yeah.
So being able to represent, well, here is the overall outcomes framework that's kind of the top level social outcomes. Here within that is the outputs and how they feed up to those outcomes. This is the activity that we're doing. But then also in terms of changing that paradigm, here's the strategies and the objectives they're driving towards as well. So being able to, show things like that to the business such that they can go, oh yes, IT genuinely understands that they're putting in this particular piece and clearly showing, yes, this is delivering towards both this social objective. It's going to impact these outputs, and we're going to deliver on, these social outcomes, and we're
Yeah.
going to deliver on these strategic objectives. Being able to unpack that complexity and present it simply and relevantly to different audiences, that's part of that, moving to that, being part of the strategic direction discussions.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to get into some of those outputs, but before we do that, I mean, I know myself and almost anyone I've ever worked with, all architects want to move in that direction and have that discussion, have that role in a company where you're shaping the strategy. But often the reality is that, as you say, you're trying to deal with 60 different strategy owners, 60 different, business owners in a more general sense that all have their own goals, have their own targets, and often they see IT as order takers, and often they see IT as the place that isn't delivering on their orders, and you have this huge prioritization clash in any company. So like practically, how did you and your CIO work together to get people to buy into that, to get them to understand that they should even listen to you with these kinds of outputs?
Yeah, I think some of this is potentially even a bit less about EA and tooling and visualizations, and more about what are the right conversations to be having at the right times as well. So sort of when I joined, the thinking around what is digital, by a lot of parts of the business was, it's about putting forms online instead of paper forms, and upgrading CRMs, things like that. Whereas we're able to show just a lot of different use cases or examples from elsewhere, particularly in the social services sectors globally of, well, you could do this, you could do that. Here's how data and analytics fits in. When generative AI came through, that was something we were on very early on in that piece to just show, well, this is how this is something that's quite different. But more specifically, if it was applied in this context, this is what it would mean. This context, this is what it would mean. And then even more recently, things like digital credentials, digital identity. So good examples of here's what digital transformation, what innovation could mean. We have things like working with children's checks, that being not just a card, but a digital credential that can then be validated. But we also have things like what's called supervised contact and transport services, where a family may have been separated and there's some supervised contact between the parent and child. Ensuring people need to be transported from and to places. There's a lot of certification or accreditation that needs to go to just to assure the safety of people in those situations. So to be able to convert that to be digital credentials that can say, well, yes, this individual is authorized to do this at this particular point in time, and have that be able to be a verifiable digital credential rather than just a card or a piece of paper. Those are the kind of, oh, now I understand what digital transformation could mean. So when you can present things in simple ways, we're obviously quite complex technologies, but in simple ways that shows this is how your business is going to change. I think those are those key conversations, the key points that sort of start to help the business believe, well, yes, this is someone who should be part of these conversations because they can add value.
Oh, okay. And this topic, maybe this is the last one on about how you operate before we get into some of the outputs. This kind of triggers a question that comes up pretty regularly, and I see it's in the question list already now. There's always a discussion about when you have an architecture team, should you be centralized or should you be federated? And when you're dealing with all these different groups, but you're trying to deliver sort of the common business architecture out through many, many different non-profit service organizations, how do you organize your team? Do you decentralize, or do you try and bring in everything together and manage across these strategies?
Yeah, so we it's easy for me because we don't have a choice in this. All of our technical enterprise architecture services, so the technical roadmap and standards type piece, they're not in my area. They're actually in another department that provides all of our tech services back to us. Similarly, the solution architecture piece and project architects, different area again within that space. So we are by those architecture practice areas already split. But perhaps it also points to what the question sort of points to what should the focus be on in some of these sort of situations. So for us, from a sort of a standards type perspective, a lot of our focus is because of the nature of our effectively the business model. A lot of the focus is far more on interoperability and ensuring that everything can play nice together in that inherently truly federated sense across so many different organizations, as opposed to standardization, centralization, which in our particular context can't work. So focusing on consistency and interoperability, consistency of information and interoperability across distributed systems, because of the distributed business model. That's just the only way we can do it.
Sounds like you end up just having a lot of coffee with a lot of people to get a lot of agreement.
Yeah, maybe.
All right. So let's dig into some of the outputs that you spoke about. So in order to make this happen, what were the small steps? Where did you start? What did you produce? How did you, like, very tangibly, what did you do to help show people?
Yeah, so partly was proving not just the need for a tool to manage the volume of data that we have to model, and the complexity, and particularly the relationships across that, but to show the value that we could actually not just, well, you need a tool because there's a lot of data, but can you actually deliver value just in spite of having so much information you need to capture? So we ran what I think, Shreya, was it like a 4 weeks all up in the end, a 4 week proof of value exercise where we sort of broke it into two particular blocks. The first block um, was sort of focused on modeling the business ecosystem of DFFH, and all those strategies and the 900 community service organizations, who was involved in what products and how that business ecosystem fitted together. And then the second piece, part of my accountability is also the information security of the social services sector as well. So what we described as the funded agency risk profile. So, what is the relative risk posture of each of these organisations? What information are they holding? What programs are they delivering? If a breach happens in this space, what would be the flow and implications across, back to the department and through to other organisations they interact with? And where are they at in terms of their maturity against our information security standards that apply to them? So we're able to pretty rapidly model out those couple of scenarios, so to show that kind of that strategy to execution piece across a complex ecosystem, and also that information security risk piece. And the reason we chose those is because those are two bits that really matter for the department, right? Risk around information. We hold some of the most sensitive, delicate information that exists, and execution across such a complex ecosystem, execution of our strategy. And we're able to really show that, create a lot of visualizations of that information quite quickly. So that was kind of the proof in the pudding, I guess, of yes, you need a tool to manage this information, but also we will be able to deliver value with that.
Okay, nice. So if I just play it back to you a little bit and put in the broader context from when I've spoken to other customers, often architecture teams, when they get started, regardless of tool, often they are stuck a bit. Analysis paralysis. Where should we start? The problem just seems so huge. And it seems like just something so simple as being able to show that transparency, being able to show to people just how complex things actually are. Because while people in the trenches may feel that complexity every day, more people in the strategy and decision making often don't see the full breadth of the complexity that you have to deal with. And so just visualizing that is a useful first step.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And my roots are in the early days of agile software development, and I'm a big believer in delivering thin vertical slices of what's in effect working software. So I'm constantly, as the team will tell you, on them about don't spend so long navel gazing around meta modeling. Make sure you build that full vertical slice, multiple visualizations, data editing pieces, and the meta model, and just grow that out bit by bit. So don't try and build all your meta model and then all your other bits and pieces after. Don't try and finesse that. Show people working stuff and iterate it and grow it. The phrase I've come to use a lot recently is the best simple thing for now, right? So the best in terms of, there's certainly a level of quality that we should be striving for in what we're outputting, but keep it simple, right? Don't model, implement more than you need to for this particular part. And that's the for now piece. So the best simple thing for now, as opposed to trying to model everything and then eventually showing someone something.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen you use that metaphor a few times with the pyramid doing the slice rather than the layers. So if you could go through an example of that, does that mean you focused on one say service area first and showed the value before you went horizontally, or was there some other way of picking the initial slice?
There've been a couple of different ways we've sliced things. So in one area at the moment, for what we describe as a business area roadmap, so stitching together across the multiple strategies in play, audit findings that need to be acted on as well, legislation changes that are going on in that space, what needs to change in terms of the business ecosystem, the org structures, the value streams, information, etc. So that's where we're looking at quite a full vertical slice of a business area,
Mm.
not all the way down into technology infrastructure, but very much business strategy through to applications, basically, and the changes there. But in other areas, we've sliced things in a different way. So, for instance, like the outcomes framework or modeling all of the strategies across the breadth of the business. So that gives us a nice, well, now we can stitch together, all the different interrelated objectives that come from many different areas that'll impact on a particular initiative. So there's a couple of different ways we've sliced it, but we've never tried to do, what I'd like to think of as too much at
Mm.
once. It's just focusing on bound up this area, have a good perspective of how it's all going to stitch together, but you don't need to implement everything all at once.
Okay.
Just start to fill in puzzle piece by puzzle piece.
All right. So to play it back a little, as you said earlier, one of the major topics in your organization is this risk posture. So you chose to use that as the first lens to do a slice, and then because that gets people's attention, it really addresses a need. It gives you that buy-in to tackle the next thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and something that's a little bit, beyond my team's direct remit, but something that again plays into that risk piece is all of our aging technologies is another thing we're looking at right now,
Mm.
and that helps win investment to remediate those pieces. But that's just one vehicle to then go, well, actually, when we do something about this area, we'll also be factoring in these strategic directions as well. We're not just focused on that aging piece and that technical risk. It's also
Mm.
the business direction that we'll be solving for at the same time. So to be able to show, well, when we're tackling that piece, we'll also tackle that piece. And now we're going to deliver far better outcomes for you. That's the ultimate synthesis of all these pieces that we're able to do.
Okay, nice. And then maybe the last thing on in this direction. Did you get buy-in at the start? Did because often like we get this question, well, where should we start? Why should we start? How do we get engagement? How do we get the
Mm,
buy-in? So did you say, okay, we noticed that, for example, risk posture is a real issue in the organization, or that's a key focus, and therefore we are going to spend some effort to do this slice, and we will show you this benefit. So you got the buy-in for the work you were going to do, or did you just show up with the output and say, ta-da?
um, yeah. So look, I guess I'm a bit fortunate in that my boss is like me, has seen good, genuine EA elsewhere in practice and delivered results. So it's always, I guess, easier when your direct manager, the CIO, is all on board from the outset. I think the buy-in piece there is um, this place is 10x complex compared to the next complex place. Um, can it be done? Like should we be trying to do this. And I think that's where the showing, doing something and showing, particularly with that proof of value piece, was the key thing to get that buy-in. But it also, I think, also making just what is business architecture, you know, and it's not capability models. What is how does this actually benefit business areas? Being able to go, well, let's look at your business through value streams, and how different parts fit together, how all the external parties around you and yourselves need to come together to deliver those outcomes. So being able to give people different lenses on their business that aren't abstract, that they can actually relate to without learning this other arcane thing called enterprise architecture. I think that's that's to me the ultimate piece that's delivered buy into it.
Okay, nice. Yeah, let's go into some of the practical tips and tricks then. So in terms of things that worked and things that you would do differently, because from those learnings, what are some of the tips you'd give to people who would want to go in your direction?
Yeah, I think the sort of touched on at the start. Using a tool as opposed to freeform boxes and lines requires a degree of discipline. So I think understanding what, standing on the shoulders of giants, many people have thought through different ways to model enterprises before. You don't need to invent these concepts. So, learning, be it BizBock or Archimate or Edgy or something like that, that gives you a few basic building blocks to start from, rather than necessarily coming up with your own pieces. And then, once you've mastered using those, then starting to evolve away from that. And then ultimately you'll get to a point where, you can kind of transcend those structured models, because you've evolved beyond them, but you haven't just jumped straight to making up whatever you want. You've actually learned through these other practice disciplines to get to that particular point. So that's kind of the key piece of advice I give, is learn, be it BizBock and the stuff from a few different people who have come from that particular school of business architecture, enterprise architecture, or Archimate, if that's the right level of detail for your environment, or other, like the Backham model, that's the subset of TOGAF, things like that. Start from those structures rather than just jumping straight into modeling whatever you want, and being really clear on this is this thing, this is this thing, these relate in these ways.
Yeah, okay. And you mentioned earlier on in this chat about being influenced by, back in the early 2000s, there was the agile development methodology wars, and I know you've mentioned to me before the Shuhari approach to learning techniques, like Alistair Coburn's way of, follow the recipe until you
So
really
that's
internalize it.
so that's what I just sort of explained without calling it that, right? But that is Shuhari, or hold, break, leave, or like for beginner to apprentice to master. That those are the stages to definitely go through in any journey. In any journey of anything you're doing, I think it's very useful to come at things with that beginner mindset, and eventually evolve to mastering pieces, rather than letting ego drive you. And I can model whatever. I know business, I know architecture, I can do this. I'll learn some fundamentals and then evolve.
Okay, so just wrapping it up, just that that structured approach to learning new techniques. There's the focusing on slices, to making sure you get a bit of value from a slice, and then extending your slices. You also mentioned clear language and being able to use clear language throughout the organization. Yeah, that were the major takeaways. Was there anything else you wanted to reiterate as a summary before we get into the audience questions?
No, I think you've summarized my key points for me far better than they are clear in my mind. So yeah, I think that's definitely the thing. That mastery journey, the plain simple language, definitely, and just focus on a slice. Don't try and build too much at once.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Okay, Shreya, have you been following along with some of these other questions that have been coming in?
Yes, I have. Thanks, Jason, and thank you, Paul. That was awesome insight into the EA practice at DFFH. I love the phrase you used, the best simple thing for now. I've heard you say that before, but it resonates really well. And eating the elephant, I think, is something I've heard you say
Oh,
before as
yeah, one
um,
bite at a time. Absolutely.
one bite at
Yeah.
a time. That's now time for the audience questions. We have got a few pre-submitted questions. Feel free to drop more into the chat, and we have a group backstage typing away furiously, who'll do their best to get back to you on these questions. All right, the first one, Paul, you talked about you were lucky enough to have that buy-in from your CIO. For those who are not so lucky, how do you cross that chasm from EA to move over to the business side? And how do you really get that buy-in from the business? Because we're seen as order takers.
Yeah. I mean, some of the consulting work I did previously, I think, where were brought in by an IT leader to look at some technology pieces, but actually fairly quickly became connected with a lot of parts of key business stakeholders, and ended up um, presenting to their full executive on here's how you might think about restructuring your strategy. Um, and yeah, that the reason I raise that as the example is because I think what that's a good example of how to start to move away from just focus on this IT piece. Because what we did was deeply understand in trying to understand the IT piece and where that need to go, you need to talk to various business stakeholders and to genuinely understand what they're trying to achieve, both short term and long term, but then to be able to stitch that together, stakeholder after stakeholder after stakeholder, and start to help people see the common gains they can gain. To me, that's the essence of moving away from that order taking. This one stakeholder is just telling me they want this particular piece to be able to start to not mediate, maybe like broker discussions between multiple areas, so that there can truly be win-win outcomes in what gets delivered. I think that's the easiest path to moving away from order taking to actually getting into business strategic direction conversations.
Yeah. The second question we have is, how do you get the balance right between meta model flexibility and governance and control? I know this is something I hear a lot as well. Flexibility sounds great, but people don't often see the consequences of changes that are made.
Yeah, yeah. I won't say that we've nailed that. I think that's the whole with great power comes great responsibility, and I think certainly RDoc is quite a flexible tool. And it's like a Swiss Army knife. You can lose a finger potentially if you're not governing the decisions around that well. Um, so that's where we have started to, try and set up good information management practices. So we're managing the life cycle of visualizations being created and also meta model governance practices. So yeah, no one's just going and changing things. There's discussion and agreement before things get changed. That does come at the cost that comes with that is speed. you're not as fast to go and create this new relationship between bits and pieces. But so I think that's necessary to ensure that the right thing gets implemented rather than something that's quick and potentially dirty.
I absolutely agree with that. The next question we have, how applicable is everything you've shared beyond the specific context of government?
Um, yeah, I think um, if anything, coming at let's say less complicated environments with this kind of thinking will help. So I'd say it's wholly applicable, and it'll certainly help model the reality of that organization better. I think often as architects, you work a few different places, you end up developing a standard toolkit or what might be called a cookie cutter type approach. You start to see different businesses in the exact same way, and start to draw pictures and things that look the same place after place. And as a consequence, you miss the things that are unique about that organization. And I dare say you see it a lot from consultancies that go from organisation to organisation and reuse the same kind of model. But no, certainly coming at things from understanding the unique. Yeah, let's go back to pre-agile. So I think it was in Mythical Man Month, right? I think there was the essence versus the accident of something. So what are the essential characteristics versus the incidental or accidental or specific characteristics of something? So yeah, every business has some essential characteristics, but what are those incidental specific characteristics that means that business is that business as opposed to a clone of another business? So I think coming at things from that approach, as opposed to that cookie cutter approach, is definitely the way to go.
Bloody hell, Paul, you're making me feel old quoting Fred Brooks in a webinar, mate.
That's fair enough. It's a lot grayer than it looks, I tell you.
Um, I'll jump to another question from this one's from me, Paul, and I'll hand over to Jason after this to see if there's any other questions that he could think of. So, in the past year of us working together, I've seen you prioritize having project management expertise and support as a part of building out your EA function, which isn't something I've seen typically. What led you
Mm.
to prioritize that while still building your EA practice at the early stages?
Because you're delivering something. I think that's the challenge with architecture is yeah, it's easy to get caught up in being an architect and doing architecture if you lose sight of the fact that you're delivering something for someone. And I think that's what having project management and a delivery focus in those outputs has really helped ensure. Because yeah, it's easy to spend a lot of time doing architecture and not actually delivering something of value to people. Having a firm project manager as part of the team is definitely something that helps focus on delivery. And as you've seen, Shreya, you can kind of co-opt them to being an architect at times as well. So you get a half-skilled resource sometimes as well.
I agree with that. For any of you who've submitted questions, we will get back to you. Jason, any last parting questions from you before we get to the last bit?
I wasn't going to until Paul mentioned Mythical Man Month, and now he's triggered me. So, so one of my favorite quotes out of Mythical Man Month is about conceptual integrity, that
Okay.
architecture has to look like it comes out of one mind, even if you're working with many different people. So when you're in
Yeah.
an organization with 60 different strategies, 900 different service providers, all the different distributed teams you mentioned, how do you make it look like it's coming out of one mind?
Was that one of the things that he revisited in the 20th anniversary and said, "Oh, I don't agree with that one anymore." There's no the whole
Not that
chief
one.
architect kind of one is a bit it's a bit of a fallacy. It's not scalable. I think
There's no
um
single architect, but it still has to have conceptual integrity. It still
yeah,
has to appear as though it has one mind.
yeah, I think you see this in all the great digital product companies, right? They're the look, feel, design, language, etc. Yeah, this is the product management aspect of enterprise architecture. And ensuring that so I talked a bit about my background. I have a master's in marketing as well, and I think brand was the only subject that I probably only liked. But that brand, that tone, that language, that style, ensuring that is clear and consistent in what you produce, regardless of the product, but certainly in the architecture. Um, I think that's also another reason why visualization tools are good because in some ways it takes away the creativity that you can get with different PowerPoint backs that look totally different. Um, but yeah, so it really comes back to language, naming conventions, that kind of standards. So we're quite big on that. We're quite big on also publishing like our data dictionary and things like that for all the information, all the references that are in there, and a review process around what gets published there. And as you noted on before, Jason, the plain simple language, because we want this to be understood by anyone in the organization, not just people in IT and certainly not just architects. So all the language we use has to be, in that classic explain it to a 10-year-old type language.
All right, thanks. And thanks for the chat. Thanks for everything today.
Thank you both. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jason. And thank you to every single one of you for joining us today. This is goodbye for now from our Jumpstart Customer Showcase week. We hope you've enjoyed the week and you found it insightful and informative for your day-to-day EA practice. Please share your thoughts with us. We'd love to hear them. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn or reach out at hello@ardoc.com. Stay tuned for an update about our Jumpstart Innovation Showcase coming in May. Until then, happy EAing.